I never thought my life would become a well-oiled machine, smooth, predictable, and suffocating. I'm 36. As a high school literature teacher in a quiet New England town, I was expected to find joy in the simple things. Discussing the symbolism in The Great Gatsby with teenagers who didn't care, grading essays late into the night, and watching the seasons change outside my classroom window. This was my world, and for the most part I was fine with it. Or so I thought. At home, everything was fine. My husband, Greg, was a talented architect who knew how to bring order to chaos. His days were filled with meetings, blueprints, and clients who adored him. Our evenings, however, were a different story, filled with polite conversations about schedules and utility bills. Did you pay the electric bill? Don't forget about your doctor's appointment next week. That was about as far as our connection went. I wasn't mad at Greg, not really. We had just settled into a routine, and somewhere along the way, the spark that had once kept us lingering at the dinner table or chatting late into the night had faded. It wasn't his fault, and it probably wasn't mine either. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was melting into the wallpaper of our carefully decorated colonial home. Then along came Jamie. Greg's nephew had just graduated from college and was in an awkward limbo between college life and the real world. When Greg invited him to stay with us while he looked for a job, I barely had time to form an opinion. I hadn't thought much of it. Another person in the house, another thing to get used to. But from the moment Jamie walked through the door, everything changed. Jamie was 23, full of energy and the kind of unwavering optimism that only comes when you're young enough to believe the world is still right under your nose. He had this easy charm, the kind that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room when he was talking to you. He teased me about my love of Victorian novels and asked questions Greg hadn't thought to ask in years. "Why do you hum when you cook?" he asked one night, tilting his head as if trying to solve a puzzle. I blinked, surprised that he'd even noticed. "I didn't realize I did that." "You do. It's cute, though," he said, grinning. "It feels like I'm in a movie or something." I laughed at it, but later, when I caught myself humming while chopping vegetables, I smiled. It wasn't just the talking. It was the way Jamie noticed things. The overgrown garden Greg had promised to tend for months. The pile of abandoned art supplies in the corner of the office. The way I stared wistfully out the window on rainy days. He noticed and he cared. One evening, when Greg was working late again, I decided to do some gardening. The weeds were literally mocking me at the time. Armed with gloves and pruning shears, I stepped outside and heard Jamie's voice behind me. "Need some help?" I hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure. Why not?" We worked side by side as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He told me about his plans, his disappointments, and the uncertainty that came with 23 years of not having a vision for the future. In response, I told him about my own unfulfilled dreams, the career as an artist I'd once considered, the travel plans that always seemed to fall by the wayside, the version of myself I'd been quietly hiding for all these years. The rainy Sunday stretched on, the steady patter against the windows wrapping the house in a cocoon of stillness. I had claimed the living room as my refuge, curling up with a cup of tea and a book, content to let the dreariness outside match the muted corners of my own thoughts. The fire crackled softly, offering a comforting warmth that felt more like an echo of something I couldn't quite name. Jamie's footsteps, light but purposeful, broke the spell of quiet. He entered the room carrying a stack of old vinyl records, his curiosity evident as he flipped through them with careful hands. The music that followed was unlike anything I'd heard in a long time, its soulful notes filling the spaces I hadn't realized were so hollow. As the melody swelled, I became aware of his presence, closer now, standing in a way that seemed deliberate yet unassuming. Without a word, the moment transformed into something playful, unexpected, and free from the heaviness that often lingered between the walls of the house. The dance that followed was clumsy, more movement than grace, but it carried an unspoken energy that neither of us acknowledged. The rhythm of the music provided a structure to our shared silence, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside ceased to matter. But as the song faded, so did the lightness of the moment. The awareness of proximity settled in the space between us, unspoken and undeniable. In the days that followed, the memory of that moment lingered, becoming a quiet disruption in the patterns I had relied on for years. I threw myself into routine, seeking solace in the predictable rhythms of teaching and grading, but nothing seemed to dull the heightened awareness I now carried. The house, which had once been my sanctuary, began to feel charged with a tension that neither of us could name. Meals shared with Greg were laced with a peculiar unease, though he remained oblivious. His attention stayed fixed on his work, the weight of his projects eclipsing any sense of shift within our home. Late one evening, I found myself drawn to the garden again. The air was cool, and the remnants of rain clung to the leaves, making them glisten under the dim light of the porch. The overgrown beds looked more chaotic than ever, a reflection of the thoughts I couldn't seem to untangle. Jamie appeared, his presence quiet but magnetic, and the silence stretched between us like a thread pulled taut. There was an apology in his expression, a mixture of hesitation and something else I couldn't quite place. The weight of that unspoken moment settled heavily, and I felt my resolve falter. The garden, once a sanctuary of honest reflection, now seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. The connection between us was no longer something I could dismiss as mere coincidence or camaraderie. It had taken root, growing quietly in the shadows of my carefully constructed life. The shift was undeniable now, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. The cracks in my perfectly ordered existence had widened, and I was no longer sure if they could or should be repaired. Jamie and I moved through the house like two figures caught in an intricate dance, careful to avoid stepping too close but unable to fully retreat. I found myself noticing everything about him. The way his laughter filled the room, how he lingered over his morning coffee as if savoring a moment he didn't want to end, the way he occupied space with a kind of quiet confidence. He brought life to the house, a sharp contrast to the muted tones that had become my reality with Greg. Greg, as ever, was consumed by work. His evenings were spent poring over blueprints and design proposals, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echoes of a life that felt more and more like a shadow of what I once dreamed it would be. One night, after another strained dinner where the only sound was the clinking of silverware against plates, I retreated to the kitchen. The bottle of wine on the counter called to me, and I poured a glass, hoping it might soften the edges of my thoughts. Jamie appeared, his presence unexpected but not unwelcome. We fell into an easy rhythm, tidying up the remains of the evening meal. The air between us felt different, heavier somehow, laden with the weight of unspoken things. When the kitchen was spotless, we lingered, neither of us ready to break the silence. The moment stretched, charged with an energy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It was as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting. Jamie's gaze met mine, steady and searching, and in that instant, the tenuous line between us dissolved. He leaned in, the movement slow and deliberate, giving me every chance to step back. But I didn't. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn away, to think of Greg, but my body betrayed me. When his lips met mine, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The kiss was brief, hesitant, yet it ignited something within me that I had almost forgotten existed. A rush of warmth spread through me, awakening emotions I had long buried beneath the weight of routine and resignation. It was as if, for the first time in years, I was truly alive. I pulled away, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave, and I stepped back, shaking my head in disbelief. The room felt too small, the air too thick, and I stumbled out into the night without a word. The cool evening air did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I wandered aimlessly through the garden, my thoughts a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and something I dared not name. The kiss had shattered the fragile balance I had clung to for so long, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, I avoided Jamie, throwing myself into work and errands in a desperate attempt to regain control. But the memory of that moment lingered, haunting me at every turn. The house, once my haven, now felt like a minefield, every corner laden with the weight of what had transpired. Jamie, to his credit, kept his distance. His silence was both a relief and a torment, leaving me to wrestle with the consequences of my actions alone. Yet, despite my best efforts to suppress it, a part of me longed for the connection we had shared. I knew I was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, and every step forward felt like a betrayal, not just to Greg, but to the carefully constructed life I had built. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, I had glimpsed a version of myself I thought I had lost. The days of uneasy quiet between Jamie and me gave way to something far more precarious. Greg, for all his inattentiveness, wasn't blind. At first, it was in the subtle ways he began watching me. A glance that lingered too long, questions about my day that felt more probing than polite. The air at home grew heavier, thick with suspicion, and I felt like an actress in a play where the audience already knew the ending. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls in soft amber hues, Greg came home earlier than usual. I had been in the garden, pruning the wild, unruly bushes that had become my escape from the turmoil inside. His voice startled me as he called my name, sharp and unfamiliar. I turned, wiping my hands on my jeans, and saw him standing there, his figure rigid against the fading light. His gaze didn't waver, and there was something unsettling in it, a quiet intensity one hadn't seen in years. He commented on the state of the garden, his tone light but clipped, as though he was testing the waters. I responded cautiously, choosing my words with care, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. He asked if I'd seen Jamie, his question too casual, his eyes betraying the effort to sound indifferent. I told him Jamie had gone out for a run, and Greg nodded, though his expression darkened slightly. He turned and walked toward the house, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that settled deep in my chest. That night at dinner, Greg was unusually quiet. The silence was different this time. Not the comfortable quiet of two people too tired to talk, but the kind that crackled with unspoken accusations. His eyes darted between Jamie and me, though neither of us dared to meet his gaze. After dinner, I retreated to our bedroom, but Greg followed me, his steps deliberate and slow. When he entered, he closed the door softly behind him, his expression unreadable but filled with a heaviness I couldn't ignore. He stood there for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before stepping closer. His hand reached for mine, and I felt my breath hitch. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a flicker of the man I had once loved deeply. "I miss you," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of all the things we hadn't said to each other in years. Then, without waiting for a response, he leaned in to kiss me. The moment should have felt natural, familiar even, but it didn't. My body stiffened, my head turning away almost instinctively. The warmth of his proximity only served to highlight the stark contrast to what I had felt with Jamie. Greg froze, his lips hovering just shy of mine, and then slowly pulled back. The air between us was thick with an unbearable tension, his hurt and confusion palpable. He studied my face, and I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as the pieces fell into place. "You're in love with him," he said quietly, his voice devoid of anger but filled with something far worse, betrayal. I opened my mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. Greg stepped back, his face unreadable now, the weight of my betrayal sinking into every line and feature. He didn't shout, didn't accuse me outright. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, his silence echoing like a thunderclap. The sound of his retreating footsteps was the only indication that he was as broken as I was. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. The fragile balance I had been trying to maintain had shattered, and there was no pretending otherwise. Greg knew, and there was no going back. Greg's departure began with an abruptness that caught me off guard. I had expected him to simmer in resentment, to lash out with sharp words or cold accusations. But instead, he acted with precision, as if everything had already been decided in his mind. I woke that morning to the sound of the closet doors creaking open, the soft rustle of fabric being pulled from hangers. At first, I thought it was another one of his work trips. Greg often left early, his business consuming more of his life than I ever did. But when I walked into the bedroom, the sight of his suitcase, open and nearly full, stopped me in my tracks. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he folded shirts and placed them neatly inside. I hovered near the doorway, my breath caught in my chest. When I finally found my voice, I asked him what he was doing. He didn't stop packing, didn't even look up as he said, "I'm leaving." The simplicity of the words gutted me. He could have shouted, could have thrown blame at my feet, but instead, his detachment cut deeper than any fury ever could. Leaving, I repeated, as if the word might change its meaning if I said it again. Greg finally turned to face me, and the look in his eyes, disappointment, exhaustion, something else I couldn't quite name, was almost unbearable. "This isn't working anymore," he said, his tone devoid of anger, filled instead with a hollow certainty. "It hasn't been for a long time." I wanted to argue, to plead with him to stay, but the truth was lodged in my throat. He was right. We had been living as strangers for years, going through the motions of a marriage that had become more habit than connection. And yet, the finality of his decision left me reeling. By the time he zipped up the suitcase and carried it down the stairs, the weight of his absence was already pressing down on me. At the front door, he paused, turning back to deliver his parting words. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said. There was no malice in his voice, just a quiet resignation. "But I can't be here anymore. I won't." And then he was gone, the echo of the door slamming shut reverberating through the empty house. In the days that followed, I moved through the house like a ghost, every room a reminder of what had been lost. Greg's absence was palpable, not just in the spaces he had once occupied but in the silence that settled over everything. Even Jamie, who had once filled the house with his energy and laughter, seemed to fade into the background. Jamie, too, left shortly after. He packed lightly, just a duffel bag and his guitar, avoiding eye contact as he mumbled something about needing a fresh start. His departure lacked the drama of Greg's but carried its own weight of finality. When he walked out the door, I didn't try to stop him. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, the solitude began to feel less like a punishment and more like an opportunity. Without Greg's steady presence or Jamie's restless energy, I was left with nothing but myself, and the daunting task of figuring out what that even meant. I started small, rediscovering the parts of me that had been buried under the weight of expectation and routine. I painted again, not just for distraction but with purpose, pouring every ounce of my confusion, my guilt, my longing into the canvases. The results were messy, chaotic, but honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. The house, once a symbol of my perfect life, began to transform into something new. I rearranged furniture, cleared out clutter, and made space for myself in ways I never had before. Each small change felt like a declaration. I am still here. Months later, one of my paintings, a sprawling, chaotic depiction of a storm-tossed sea, was featured in a local gallery. Standing in the middle of the exhibit, surrounded by strangers murmuring their appreciation, I felt a flicker of pride. It was then that I saw Greg. He was standing near the edge of the room, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. I wondered what he was thinking, if he regretted leaving, if he still thought of me the way I often thought of him. But then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. As I left the gallery that night, the cool evening air filling my lungs, I felt a strange sense of closure. Greg had been right. We couldn't continue the way we had been. But his departure, as painful as it was, had forced me to confront myself in ways I never would have otherwise. This wasn't the life I had planned, nor the one I had wanted. But it was mine, messy and imperfect, and for the first time, I was ready to embrace it. Time softened some wounds, but it left others raw, refusing to heal. Even as I rebuilt my life, there was a part of me that lingered in the past, a quiet but persistent yearning that I couldn't extinguish. Greg's departure had freed me, and I had taken full advantage of that freedom, but it hadn't untangled the emotions that Jamie had stirred in me. I tried. I truly did. I went to art shows, socialized at local events, and even humored a few dates. Men my age were kind, established, and predictable. They were everything I should have wanted, but none of them sparked the restless energy I craved. They didn't make me feel alive in the way Jamie had. Jamie. His name hung in the corners of my mind, unspoken but ever-present. I knew it was absurd, dangerous, even, to let myself dwell on him. But as much as I fought it, I couldn't forget. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who truly mattered. The stolen moments we shared in the dim light of the kitchen, or beneath the sprawling canopy of stars in the garden. Months passed, Then a year, and still, the memories haunted me. By the time I had fully reestablished myself, my art flourishing, my confidence returning, I decided to stop running from what I knew to be true. Jamie was the only person who had ever seen me, the real me, in a way that no one else had. And while it defied reason, while it flew in the face of everything I was supposed to want, I couldn't deny it any longer. I reached out to him. It wasn't an easy decision. The fear of rejection gnawed at me. The possibility that he had moved on, forgotten about me, found someone his own age. But the alternative, never knowing, never taking the chance, was worse. When Jamie answered my call, his voice was cautious, as if he wasn't sure what to expect. I told him I wanted to talk, to meet, and he agreed. We met at a small cafe in the city, far enough from home that we wouldn't risk being seen by anyone who knew us. He looked older, more confident, but his smile was still the same. I didn't waste time. Life was too short, and I had wasted enough of it already. I told him the truth, that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about him, that I wanted to see where this could go, consequences be damned. His reaction was unreadable at first, but then his face softened, and I saw a flicker of the vulnerability he had once shared with me. He admitted he had felt the same, that leaving had been as painful for him as it was for me. We agreed to start over, cautiously this time, away from prying eyes and the weight of familial expectations. It wasn't about rebellion or filling a void. It was about finding something that made us both feel alive. The world would judge us, I knew that much. But after everything I had been through, I didn't care anymore. My life had been dictated by other people's expectations for too long. Now, finally, I was living it for myself. Jamie and I weren't perfect, but we were honest. And in a world full of pretense, that was enough. 6 months had passed since Jamie and I made that decision to begin again, and the world felt different. More fragile, perhaps, but also freer. We were still careful, still testing the boundaries of what we could be. But there was a quiet understanding between us now, a recognition of the complexities we both carried and a deep, unspoken respect for the journey that had led us here. Life had a new rhythm. I'd spent years shaping my world into something familiar, something comfortable. But with Jamie, nothing was predictable, and it was in that unpredictability that I found a strange peace. We didn't rush. We didn't make any grand gestures. Instead, we carved out small moments. Quiet mornings at the cafe, long walks in the park, weekends spent in my studio, where I painted and he played his guitar. We didn't need to speak of the past, of the mistakes and the consequences. The things that had once haunted me had fallen into the background, their weight no longer pulling me down. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, the summer night wrapping us in its warmth, I noticed how easily we fell into silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes, not of discomfort, but of something much deeper. It wasn't the same silence we had shared when I was married to Greg, when the air felt suffocating and unspoken resentments festered. This was different, peaceful, full of possibility. I looked over at Jamie, his face softened by the dim light of the setting sun, and for a moment, everything else faded. My heart raced with a quiet anticipation, and I knew that this wasn't just a fleeting moment, that I wasn't just filling a void anymore. This was real. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing his. He turned to me, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. I saw the same longing in his eyes, the same recognition of what we had quietly, slowly become. Then, as if the years of uncertainty and hesitation had culminated in this one moment, he leaned in, and so did I. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters of this new chapter. But as it deepened, the world seemed to fall away. There was no past, no hesitation, only the sensation of being truly seen, truly known. When we finally pulled away, my lips tingling from the kiss, I couldn't help but smile. I hadn't realized how much I needed this, how much I needed him, until that very second. Jamie smiled back, his expression a mixture of contentment and something else, something more tender, more raw. "I've missed this," I whispered, barely audible, but it was enough. He didn't need to say anything. Instead, he just pulled me closer, wrapping his arms around me as if he was holding on to something precious, something fleeting but real. In that embrace, I knew, No matter what had come before, no matter the judgment or the consequences, this was where I was meant to be.